To understand Jeffrey Epstein's end in a Manhattan cell, we must first open the file on his ascent, a process that defies all conventional financial logic. In official records, Epstein appears as a brilliant wealth manager, a mathematical genius operating in the highest echelons of Wall Street. However, for investigation and archive, the fundamental question is not how much money he had, but how a man who started as a high school math teacher without a college degree ended up rubbing shoulders with presidents, Nobel Prize winners, and European royalty. The answer lies not in his investments, but in his ability to archive human weaknesses. Epstein didn't manage money. He managed secrets. The origin of his fortune is the first major legal void in this dossier. He was closely linked to Leslie Wexner, the tycoon behind Victoria's Secret, who granted him total power of attorney over his finances, something unprecedented in the corporate world. But archive analysts suggest the relationship was bidirectional. Epstein began building a network of properties that functioned as intelligence outposts. His New York residence, the Palm Beach mansion, and finally, the infamous Little St. James Island in the British Virgin Islands. These properties were not just luxury trophies. They were equipped, according to former employees, with military-grade surveillance systems, hidden cameras behind two-way mirrors and microphones in every room. Epstein's private archive was not a folder of documents. It was a visual database of the world's elite at their most vulnerable. In this first act of our investigation, we must analyze the concept of blackmail as currency. In the traditional market, value is measured in gold or stocks. In Epstein's world, value was measured by the ability to destroy a reputation. The island, known by locals as Pedophile Island or Orgy Island, was the perfect bait. Epstein offered the most powerful men in the world something money could not buy: total impunity for their darkest desires in a territory outside any jurisdiction. But that impunity came with an invisible price. Every act was recorded. Every encounter was logged onto the island's private servers. Epstein wasn't looking for friends, he was looking for assets. A politician with a brilliant career is useful, but a politician recorded in a compromising situation is a slave to the system. Epstein's recruitment structure was also a surgical precision algorithm. He used figures like Epstein-Maxwell to provide a veneer of sophistication and respectability to his operations. Maxwell, the daughter of a media mogul linked to intelligence services, was the key that opened the doors to the British aristocracy and New York high society. Together, they created a recruitment pyramid where victims were coerced into bringing in new young women under the promise of education or modeling careers. For the archive of this investigation, it is crucial to understand that Epstein did not operate alone. He was the visible face of an infrastructure that required private transport logistics, the famous Lolita Express, security personnel with unbreakable non-disclosure agreements, and a network of lawyers who formed a nearly impenetrable legal wall. Who was Jeffrey Epstein really? A lone predator or an intelligence agent tasked with compromising world leaders? Analyzing his ties to MIT, his alleged connections to Mossad and CIA programs, and his frequent visits to the White House, the dossier suggests that Epstein was the central node of a blackmail network designed to influence global politics. This is not a case of sexual deviance. It is a case of geopolitical control. Epstein's private archive was the most expensive insurance policy in the world, and in this documentary, we are going to start bringing those documents out of the darkness. The island was not a holiday destination. It was the headquarters for an extortion machine that years later would force the most powerful men on the planet to pretend they never knew the man who held the keys to their secrets. In civil aviation, every kilometer traveled leaves a digital footprint: flight plans, passenger logs, and cargo manifests. However, in Jeffrey Epstein's archive, the Boeing 727 identified with tail number N221JE, dubbed by the press and victims as the Lolita Express, operated in a legal gray area of international law. For investigation and archive, this plane was not merely a luxury means of transport. It was a mobile extension of Little St. James Island, a confined space where the laws of the countries of origin and destination vanished, allowing recruitment and abuse to begin at 30,000 feet. Analysis of the flight manifests, recovered after years of litigation, reveals a passenger list that reads like a who's who of global power. Presidents, Oscar-winning directors, world-renowned scientists, and royalty. But what should truly alarm any investigator is the recurrence of underage names alongside these titans of the modern world. Records show constant flights between Teterboro, Palm Beach, Paris, and the Virgin Islands. The plane functioned as an airlift for influence peddling. Epstein used the opulence of the 727, remodeled to include private bedrooms and luxury lounges, as a tool for seducing his guests and intimidating his victims. A crucial technical aspect this archive puts under the microscope is the role of the pilots and cabin crew. In executive aviation, discretion is the norm, but in Epstein's case, discretion was replaced by systemic complicity, protected by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Epstein's pilots were not just employees. They were silent witnesses to a machine that operated in full view of airport authorities across 3 continents. How is it possible that a plane with unaccompanied minors crossed international borders hundreds of times without triggering a single alarm at customs? The answer points once again toward protection from high places and the use of private airports where security checks were, at best, a courtesy formality. Inside the cabin of the Lolita Express, time stood still. Victim testimonies describe how the environment was designed to disorient them. Extreme luxury mixed with the presence of powerful figures the girls had only seen on television, creating a status-induced Stockholm syndrome. For Epstein, the plane was the ideal place for the initial grooming, the process of normalizing abusive behavior under the guise of a sophisticated lifestyle. Meanwhile, in the plane's maintenance logs, millions in expenses were recorded, hiding the true nature of the trips under concepts like consulting and investment logistics. The plane was an office, a bedroom, and above all, a high-speed trap. But the Lolita Express had an even darker function: the transport of material. It is suspected that the plane was used to move data servers and physical records between Epstein's various properties to avoid coordinated police raids. As a mobile asset, Epstein could move evidence of his blackmail from one jurisdiction to another in a matter of hours. In the second act, we understand that Epstein's network was not static. It was a global logistical network that used private aviation to stay one step ahead of justice. The N-212JE was the engine that allowed the island's stain to spread across the globe, leaving a trail of flight logs that today are irrefutable proof of who was truly on board Jeffrey Epstein's machinery. To the outside world, Little St. James was a paradise speck of land in the Caribbean Sea. But in the blueprints of investigation and archive, this 70-acre island reveals itself as an engineering fortress designed for exclusivity, surveillance, and concealment. Purchased by Epstein in 1998 for nearly $8 million, the island was not a vacation retreat. It was a de facto sovereign state where the rules of civilization did not apply. In analyzing the geography of silence surrounding this place, we must examine its architecture. A disturbing blend of neoclassical opulence and structures that seem pulled from a psychological operations manual. The most unsettling element of the island is undoubtedly the building popularly known as the Temple. Situated at one end of the property, this structure with white walls, blue stripes, and a golden dome has been the subject of intense speculation. Unlike the guest villas, the temple does not seem to have a clear residential function. Satellite image analysts have noted details that defy decorative logic: painted windows that are not real, and a reinforced lock that, according to contractors who worked on the island, seemed designed to keep someone or something in, not out. Was it a gym, a library, or a high-tech recording center? Some testimonies suggest that beneath that golden dome lay the nerve center of Epstein's archive, the place where data collected by hidden cameras across the rest of the property was processed. However, the true secret of Little St. James might not be on the surface, but beneath it. Residents of neighboring islands and former employees have spoken for years of a system of tunnels and underground levels connecting the main structures. Although the FBI has not officially confirmed the extent of these excavations, construction records show earth-moving activities and purchases of heavy machinery that do not align with the creation of simple water cisterns. In the context of a global blackmail system, Underground spaces offer an unmatched tactical advantage. They are invisible to satellites and drones. They were the perfect place for storing physical files and servers that Epstein did not want detected by rival intelligence agencies or international law enforcement. The island's logistics were also an exercise in total control. Access was only possible by helicopter or private boat, and the service staff consisted mostly of foreign nationals with visas tied directly to Epstein's companies. This created a language barrier and a legal dependency that guaranteed silence. Employees were forbidden from speaking to guests and were instructed never to look directly at the powerful figures disembarking at the dock. In this ecosystem of isolation, Epstein functioned as an absolute monarch. The island's archive records visits from scientists discussing theories of eugenics and transhumanism, themes that obsessed Epstein. He viewed the island not just as a place of pleasure, but as a social laboratory where he could experiment with the morality of the world's most influential men. A detail often overlooked is the island's communication system. Little St. James had its own infrastructure of antennas and high-speed data links, unusual for a private property in that location in the early 2000s. This reinforces the theory that the island was, in essence, an intelligence node. From there, Epstein could transmit encrypted information and manage his blackmail network with the security that signals were difficult to intercept. The architecture of Little St. James was at the service of the archive. Every guest villa was a recording set, every path was under the eye of a camera, and every shaded corner was a zone designed for secrecy. In the end, the island was the physical reflection of Jeffrey Epstein's mind, a dazzling surface hiding a labyrinth of tunnels, cameras, and truths that the world is still trying to unearth. For Jeffrey Epstein's archive to function, it wasn't enough to have an island and a plane. A constant input of raw material was required. In this fourth act of investigation and archive, we must deconstruct the social engineering behind the recruitment network, a pyramidal structure whose primary architect was Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell was not merely a companion. She was the logistical operator who transformed Epstein's predatory instincts into a corporate system of victim acquisition. Daughter of media mogul Robert Maxwell, she understood better than anyone how status, money, and sophistication could be utilized as weapons of mass manipulation. Maxwell's playbook was not written on paper, but its rules were applied with terrifying precision in every corner of the network. Recruitment began with the identification of vulnerability. The network did not search for its victims in the elite circles Epstein frequented. It looked for them in the cracks of the system. Shopping malls, bus stops in low-income neighborhoods, art schools with financially struggling students, and broken homes. Maxwell utilized an approach that human trafficking experts call grooming in stages. The first contact was never sexual, it was aspirational. They were promised a career in modeling, help paying for college, or a job opportunity at the exclusive mansion of a billionaire philanthropist. In the archive of judicial testimonies, victims agree on a pattern. Ghislaine was the friendly face, the mother figure who validated the safety of the environment. Her presence was the seal of respectability that deactivated the natural alarms of any teenager. Once a victim entered Epstein's radius of influence, the isolation phase began. They were invited to the Palm Beach mansion, or the New York townhouse, under the pretext of giving a therapeutic massage to Epstein. Here the network used a peer pressure tactic. Other young women who had already been recruited and were under Maxwell's control were used to normalize the situation. If others were doing it and receiving money, gifts, or designer clothing, the victim began to doubt her own moral judgment. This is where the archive reveals the economic cruelty of the system. Epstein paid amounts that were astronomical for a 15-year-old, creating immediate financial dependency. The money was not a gift. It was an unwritten contract of silence that made them feel like accomplices in their own abuse. But Maxwell's dark genius was the creation of the pyramid system. Victims were offered additional bonuses if they brought their friends or acquaintances into the network. This turned the victim into a recruiter, fragmenting her identity and making it harder for her to report the crimes in the future for fear of being considered part of the criminal enterprise. The investigation and archive files analyze Maxwell's phone records and planners, where young women's names were not stored as people, but as logistical assets. There was constant turnover, a flow designed so that Epstein would never get bored, and so that the island's guests would always have novelties. This logistics required total administrative control. Passports held, flights coordinated on the Lolita Express, and a network of safe houses where the young women waited to be called. Maxwell's role was also that of a class filter. She was the one who trained the young women in the protocols of high society. She taught them how to dress, how to speak, and how to behave before the most powerful men in the world. This served a dual purpose. First, it made the young women more attractive to high-level guests, and second, it created cognitive dissonance in the victims. They were treated like princesses on a private jet one day, and like exchange objects the next. The archive highlights that this network would not have survived without the protection network that the Maxwell name and Epstein's fortune purchased. The network's lawyers were always ready to silence any attempted report with out-of-court settlements loaded with confidentiality clauses that threatened financial ruin to anyone who spoke out. In this act, we understand that recruitment was not the impulsive act of a sick man. It was a social intelligence operation designed to fuel a market of favors and blackmail. Ghislaine Maxwell built a wall of silence made of money and psychological manipulation that protected Epstein for decades. The recruitment network was the fuel that kept the island's machinery turning, and every young woman who entered the system became, unknowingly, a piece of the private archive that Epstein would use to control the world. Maxwell's playbook was, ultimately, the tool that allowed the unimaginable to become a daily routine at the highest levels of global power. In the annals of American justice, there are agreements that defy not only the law but the very logic of the penal system. The file we open now, dated 2008 in the Southern District of Florida, is perhaps the most shameful document in the entire Jeffrey Epstein dossier. After years of police investigations in Palm Beach, where Police Chief Michael Ryder had accumulated irrefutable evidence that Epstein was operating a minor trafficking ring out of his mansion, the judicial system was poised for a life sentence. However, what took place in the federal prosecutor's offices was not a trial, but a surrender, a non-prosecution agreement so broad and protective that in practice it made Jeffrey Epstein legally untouchable, a man with a license to remain a predator. To understand the magnitude of this anomaly, we must analyze the names involved. Heading the prosecution was Alexander Acosta, a man with a rising political career who would later become Secretary of Labor under the Donald Trump administration. Acosta signed a secret pact that not only protected Epstein, but also all of his potential co-conspirators, known and unknown. This means that, with a single signature, the United States judicial system preemptively shielded Ghislaine Maxwell, the Lolita Express pilots, the island administrators, and most disturbingly, any high-level figure who had participated in the network's activities. It was a corporate amnesty for a crime of a human nature. The archive reveals that this pact was negotiated behind the victims' backs, violating the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which requires that victims be informed of plea agreements. How did a man facing accusations of abusing dozens of minors obtain a deal normally reserved for high-value national security informants? This is where the investigation and archive dossier delves into the shadows. According to later reports, when Acosta was questioned about the leniency of the deal, his response was cryptic yet revealing. "I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and was above my pay grade." This sentence is the Rosetta Stone of the case. If Epstein was an asset for intelligence agencies, whether the CIA, Mossad, or a combination of both, the 2008 pact was not judicial negligence, but an extraction operation. It was about protecting the blackmail network that fed intelligence files with compromising information on world leaders. The resulting sentence was a technical farce. Epstein was sentenced to only 13 months in a county jail, not a federal prison. But the most outrageous part was the work release program. For 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, Epstein left his cell to go to his office in West Palm Beach. Surveillance logs from that era show that his office remained a parade of visitors, and according to new allegations, the recruitment did not stop. It simply became more cautious. He had his own private security team waiting for him at the jail gates in armored vehicles. He wasn't serving a sentence, he was keeping office hours from a minimum security hotel paid for by taxpayers. This pact had devastating consequences for the credibility of the legal system. By allowing Epstein to plead guilty to a single count of solicitation of prostitution, a term that grotesquely downplays the trafficking of minors, the state of Florida closed the door for other victims to testify. Epstein's lawyers, a dream team that included Alan Dershowitz and Jay Lefkowitz, used every legal loophole and political connection to stifle the investigation. The archive of correspondence between prosecutors and defense attorneys shows an alarming familiarity, an exchange of favors where justice became a bargaining chip. It was a coordinated assault on the truth, designed so that Epstein's file would never see the light of day in a public trial. The 2008 agreement also included a confidentiality clause that prevented details of the original Palm Beach investigation from being shared with other jurisdictions. This allowed Epstein to return to New York and Paris with his reputation legally clean, presenting himself once again as a billionaire philanthropist who had simply had a woman problem in the past. This forced rehabilitation allowed him to infiltrate MIT, Harvard, and the circles of Bill Gates and other global philanthropists again. Without the Florida Pact, Epstein would have been a pariah. With it, he became a ghost walking among the elite, knowing that the system owed him his freedom, and that his blackmail files were his best life insurance policy. In this act, we reach a cold conclusion. Jeffrey Epstein did not beat the system. He was a fundamental piece of the system. The Florida Pact was proof that at certain levels of power, the law is optional, and immunity is a service that can be bought or negotiated through the exchange of state secrets. While the victims wept in silence watching their aggressor leave jail every morning in a Mercedes-Benz, the world understood that Michael Jackson's room 7102 or Epstein's Island were not anomalies, but sovereign territories where the archive is the only law that prevails. This agreement was the necessary prologue to the tragic and mysterious end that would occur years later, in a New York cell. Because once the legal protectorate failed, Epstein went from being a valuable asset to being the most dangerous loose end on the planet. In the world of high diplomacy and transnational capital, relationships are measured not by friendship, but by utility. For Meagher's investigation and archive, Jeffrey Epstein's inner circle was not a group of friends. It was a power ecosystem designed to be impregnable. Opening the Lolita Express flight logs and the financier's black books, we find a convergence of names that defies statistical probability. It is no coincidence that a man with no real industry behind him managed to orbit the two most influential spheres on the planet, American politics represented by Bill Clinton, and the European aristocracy, personified by Prince Andrew, Duke of York. This act analyzes how Epstein used these connections not just for pleasure, but as a geopolitical shield that allowed him to operate with an impunity no ordinary billionaire could dream of. Let's begin with the Clinton effect. Flight records confirm that former President Bill Clinton flew on Epstein's plane at least 26 documented times. Although Clinton has denied ever visiting Little St. James Island, the frequency of his trips and the nature of his relationship with Epstein suggest a proximity that goes beyond occasional philanthropy. Epstein did not just offer transportation, he offered an environment of absolute privacy far beyond the reach of the Secret Service and public scrutiny. In the archive of this investigation, Clinton's figure is key because he represented the ultimate level of social validation. If the most powerful man in the free world accepted Epstein's hospitality, who would dare question the origin of his fortune or the legality of his activities? This association allowed Epstein to infiltrate the Clinton Foundation and international forums, positioning himself as a power broker who could open doors in Washington with a single call. Across the Atlantic, the connection to the House of Windsor through Prince Andrew provided Epstein with something money cannot buy: lineage and a veneer of historical honorability. The relationship between the two, which began in the 1990s through the mediation of Ghislaine Maxwell, was so close that Prince Andrew continued to visit Epstein even after his 2008 conviction in Florida. The photographic archive, including the infamous image of the Duke of York walking through Central Park with a convicted predator, is proof of a loyalty that defies all logic of public relations. But what was Epstein seeking in Prince Andrew? The answer lies in sovereignty. The Windsors represent a form of diplomatic and social immunity that is the ultimate armor. By having a member of the British royal family in his guest-harbored archive, Epstein sent a clear message to any intelligence agency. Touching him meant provoking an international incident with the British Crown, but the circle did not end with politics and royalty. Epstein's contact archive included figures like Donald Trump, who in a 2002 interview described Epstein as a rich, terrific guy with whom he shared a taste for younger women, though he later sought to distance himself following the arrests. We also find Bill Gates, whose relationship with Epstein began years after the financier's first conviction, under the guise of discussing global philanthropy projects. The archive of emails and meetings at the New York mansion suggests that Epstein used these tech titans to rebuild his image and potentially seek new channels of funding and protection. In Epstein's world, every guest was an insurance policy. The more high-profile names he accumulated in his logs, the harder it became for any prosecutor or police agency to bring down his structure without causing an earthquake that would collapse the foundations of the West's most respected institutions. It is crucial to analyze the psychology of this inner circle. Epstein did not just provide access to minors, he provided a space of dour absolute freedom, where men who spent their lives under the pressure of public scrutiny could act without consequences. It was a luxury trap. In our investigation and archive, we hypothesize that Epstein did not seek money from these men, he already had enough, but rather their moral debt. A president or a prince who has been a witness or participant in illegal activities on a private island automatically becomes an asset for Epstein. The network functioned like a spider web, where the silk was blackmail, and the threads extended from the halls of the U.S. Congress to the palaces of London. This circle of non-armed friends was, in reality, a club of mutual hostages where silence was the prerequisite for membership. Ghislaine Maxwell's role in maintaining this circle was fundamental. She was the cultural translator between Epstein's vulgar world and the sophistication of his guests. It was she who organized the dinners, who sent the thank-you notes, and who ensured that the logistics of pleasure were flawless. The archive demonstrates that Maxwell used her British pedigree to make extremely cautious men lower their guard. Without her, Epstein would have been seen as an eccentric nouveau riche with dark tastes. With her, he became the host to the global elite. The tragedy of this inner circle is that for decades, no one in the highest positions of power on the planet said a word. Everyone saw, everyone heard, and many participated while Epstein's archive grew, documenting every sin, every weakness, and every signature on a contract of silence that would only be broken when the weight of the secrets became unbearable for the very system that protected them. To the outside world, Jeffrey Epstein's properties were temples of luxury. For investigation and archive, they were signal intelligence, SIGINT, stations disguised as private residences. The name Zorro is no coincidence. It was the code name for Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, but it also symbolizes the cunning of a man who never left anything to chance. In this seventh act, we must analyze the surveillance technology that turned every room, every hallway, and every bathroom of his mansions into a recording device. According to testimonies from former employees and technicians who installed these systems, Epstein wasn't just looking for security. He was seeking the total capture of human behavior in its rawest and most compromising state. The mansions in New York, Palm Beach, and the island of Little St. James were equipped with a network of hidden cameras so sophisticated it rivaled the methods of the Stasi or the KGB during the Cold War. The nerve center of this operation was located in the 71st Street mansion in New York, one of Manhattan's largest private residences. Following the FBI raid in 2019, agents found a massive amount of hard drives, videotapes, and servers containing what Epstein called his insurance archive. But the most revealing find was the placement of the cameras. They weren't on the perimeters to detect intruders. They were integrated into the most mundane objects: smoke sensors, picture frames, alarm clocks, and even inside two-way mirrors. The goal was to capture intimate encounters between his high-profile guests and the young women recruited by the network. The archive suggests that Epstein spent hours reviewing this material, not just out of voyeuristic deviance, but to identify pressure points. A passing comment about a shady deal, a gesture of weakness, or an illegal activity recorded in 4K were financial assets that Epstein guarded with monastic discipline. The technical sophistication of this espionage system raises a disturbing question. How could a financier, no matter how wealthy, manage such a volume of intelligence without outside help? This is where our investigations file connects Epstein to the worlds of technology and defense. It is known that Epstein funded advanced research at MIT and other institutions and maintained relationships with scientists specializing in artificial intelligence and data processing long before these topics became global trends. There is documented hypothesis that Epstein used facial and voice recognition algorithms to automatically tag the content of his recordings. If a senator entered the massage room at the Palm Beach mansion, the system didn't just record. It classified the video under the politician's name, creating a fast-search digital blackmail library. But the espionage wasn't limited to the visual. Epstein's private archive included the interception of communications. It is suspected that the Wi-Fi networks in his properties were designed as honeypots or data traps. When a guest connected to the wireless network on the island or his private jet, all their emails, text messages, and passwords passed through an intermediate server controlled by Epstein's security team. In the intelligence world, this is known as a man-in-the-middle attack. Epstein didn't just know what his guests were doing in his presence. He knew what they were planning in their businesses and their private lives. This ability to see through the digital walls of the elite gave him an unfair advantage on Wall Street and in the halls of power, allowing him to predict market moves or political decisions before they became public. What happened to this archive after his death? This is the greatest mystery in the dossier. During the search of the New York mansion, the FBI found a safe containing diamonds, fake passports, and stacks of hard drives. But many investigators believe the bulk of the sensitive material was removed before authorities arrived. Epstein's security staff, often composed of former Foreign Special Forces agents, had protocols for data destruction and remote wiping. There is talk of encrypted servers in tax havens and on the island itself that could be activated or destroyed with a single command. If the Zorro archive were to fall into the wrong hands, or the right ones, it could trigger the collapse of multiple governments and the ruin of the world's largest corporations. Surveillance was not a hobby. It was the operating system of Jeffrey Epstein's life. At the end of this act, we understand that Epstein was not a billionaire with cameras out of paranoia. He was a collector of secrets who used technology as a fishing net. Every invitation to his mansion was an invitation to enter a recording studio where the script was already written by him. The Zorro archive is proof that in the 21st century, information is more valuable than money, and that privacy is a luxury Epstein's friends lost the moment they agreed to cross the threshold of his properties. The architecture of surveillance he built remains a shadow looming over every public figure who ever slept in the 71st Street guest room, reminding them that somewhere a hard drive might hold the end of their careers. For Jeffrey Epstein, money was a tool and blackmail was a defense, but science was his true religion. In this eighth act of investigation and archive, we must analyze one of the most disturbing facets of his file: his obsession with genetics, eugenics, and transhumanism. Epstein didn't just want to control the political elite. He wanted to control the source code of humanity. Through million-dollar donations to institutions like Harvard, MIT, and the University of Arizona, the financier embedded himself into the fabric of the global scientific vanguard. But his interests were not purely philanthropic. According to the archive of his private meetings and testimonies from academics who frequented his dinners, Epstein used his fortune to surround himself with brilliant minds and promote a vision of the future that many would consider straight out of a sci-fi dystopia: the creation of a super race driven by his own DNA. Eugenics, the pseudoscience that seeks to improve the human species through genetic selection, has a dark history linked to the most authoritarian regimes of the 20th century. However, in Epstein's circle, this ideology was disguised as transhumanism and synthetic biology. Epstein was fascinated with the idea of seeding the world with his own offspring. The archive reveals detailed plans to turn his Zorro ranch in New Mexico into a base for large-scale insemination of women. This was not merely a desire for fatherhood, it was a delusion of biological grandeur. He wanted his genes, which he considered superior due to his financial and intellectual success, to propagate exponentially. To achieve this, he regularly consulted with fertility and genetics experts, looking for ways to optimize the inheritance of his traits. This aspect of his life demonstrates that Epstein did not see himself as a mere mortal, but as an entity that should endure through the centuries. The connection to MIT and its Media Lab is a particularly dark chapter in this dossier. Epstein donated hundreds of thousands of dollars despite being a convicted sex offender, doing so under a veil of anonymity that the institution's leadership willingly accepted. What did that money truly buy? Access to the most advanced developments in artificial intelligence, cryogenics, and gene editing. Epstein was obsessed with immortality. The technical archive of his scientific interests shows investments in companies promising to freeze human bodies for future reanimation and research into downloading human consciousness onto digital servers. He viewed the human body as obsolete hardware that could be upgraded or replaced. By funding these scientists, Epstein ensured he was in the front row for any breakthrough that could extend his own life or enhance his cognitive abilities. It is crucial to understand the power dynamics Epstein exercised over the scientific community. Many of the world's most respected researchers, including Nobel laureates like Murray Gell-Mann or Lawrence Krauss, accepted his invitations to the island and his mansions. Epstein used the same technique he used with politicians: the seduction of status and access to unlimited resources. He offered them an environment where they could discuss radical ideas without the ethical constraints of university boards. In exchange, they provided him with the intellectual validation he craved. In Epstein's scientific correspondence archive, a language of complicity is evident. He presented himself as an intellectual peer, capable of understanding the most complex theories of physics and biology. This validation was his ultimate shield. If the world's most brilliant scientist trusted him, the general public must be wrong about his crimes. But there was an even more practical side to his relationship with science. Epstein utilized his knowledge of genetics and psychology to refine his methods of manipulation. He was interested in the study of oxytocin, the so-called love hormone, and how it could be used to generate instant trust in his victims. He also researched the neuroscience of decision-making to understand how to break the will of the powerful men he wanted to blackmail. The archive suggests that Little St. James was not just a luxury brothel, but a laboratory for observing human behavior under extreme conditions. Epstein analyzed his guests' reactions like an entomologist analyzes insects, searching for the biological weaknesses he could exploit for his own ends. At the end of this act, the image of Jeffrey Epstein becomes even more terrifying. He is no longer just a sexual predator or a blackmail agent. He is a man who sought to play God. His scientific archive is the testimony of an ambition that transcended material wealth. He wanted to leave an indelible mark on the human genome and achieve a form of technological eternity. The tragedy is that many of the brightest minds of our generation allowed this man to fund their dreams in exchange for validating his nightmares. Epstein's scientific connection reminds us that knowledge without ethics is the world's most dangerous tool, and that the pursuit of genetic perfection can hide the darkest instincts of human nature. The Zorro Ranch and Little St. James Island were two sides of the same coin. One man's attempt to create a world in his own image, where law, morality, and biology were all subject to his will. For more than a decade following the Florida Pact, Jeffrey Epstein lived in a parallel reality where laws were mere suggestions, and his impunity was an absolute fact. However, in July 2019, the air at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey turned heavy for the financier. In this ninth act of investigation and archive, we analyzed the dismantling of his protection structure. Epstein's arrest upon returning from Paris was not a miscalculation on his part, but the result of a tectonic shift in public opinion and the spheres of power that had previously shielded him. The modern Me Too movement had transformed the social climate, and a series of exhaustive reports by the Miami Herald, led by journalist Julie K. Brown, had once again shone a light on the infamous 2008 deal. The U.S. Justice Archive could no longer ignore the outcry of the victims who, now adults, demanded that the system repair its original betrayal. The arrest was executed by agents from the FBI's Human Trafficking Unit and prosecutors from the Southern District of New York, SDNY. Stepping off his private jet, Epstein was met with a reality he couldn't buy. handcuffs, and a warrant for sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy. The indictment file was devastating. Unlike in 2008, prosecutors this time did not negotiate in secret. The search of his 71st Street mansion in Manhattan, conducted shortly after the arrest, provided the missing physical evidence. Thousands of sexually explicit photographs, diamonds, cash, and an expired foreign passport with Epstein's photo, but a different name were found, suggesting he always had an escape plan, ready for the moment his protectors turned their backs on him. Why now? This is the question that dominates the intelligence file of this act. A compelling theory is that Epstein had become too loud. His constant presence in high-profile circles and his attempts to rehabilitate his image through science and technology were drawing unwanted attention to his powerful associates. In the world of espionage and power, an asset becomes a liability when its visibility puts the network's integrity at risk. By being arrested by the SDNY, a jurisdiction known for its independence and aggression, it became clear that the Florida Pact was no longer valid. The system needed a sacrifice to quell public outrage, and Epstein, whose blackmail archive was a threat to everyone, found himself alone on the board. His friends from the inner circle vanished overnight, issuing press releases that reeked of collective amnesia regarding their relationship with him. Incarceration at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in New York, set the stage for the final act of his public life. The archive of his days in prison describes a man who went from absolute arrogance to a cold understanding of his fate. Epstein knew that the upcoming trial would not be like Florida. This time, the victims were going to speak before the world, and the contents of his safes were being cataloged by the FBI. The possibility of his insurance archive being exposed in a public courtroom was the worst-case scenario for the global elite. Every day Epstein spent alive in that cell. Tension in the halls of power in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv mounted. He was the only person who could connect the dots between the private crimes of the powerful and the logistics of his trafficking network. In this act, we must also consider the geopolitical dimension. In 2019, the alliances that had protected Epstein throughout the 90s and 2000s were in flux. Shifts in intelligence agencies and internal struggles within the U.S. administration created a window of opportunity for prosecutors to act. The investigation and archive file suggests that the arrest was a cleanup operation. If Epstein could not be controlled, he had to be neutralized through the legal system. However, the system underestimated, or perhaps calculated perfectly, what would happen when a man who holds the secrets of the most powerful is cornered in a high-security cell. His arrest was not the end of the story, but the prologue to a mystery that would challenge trust in United States correctional institutions. The collapse of Jeffrey Epstein in 2019 marks the end of the era of blatant impunity. His arrest symbolized a momentary victory for truth, but it also started a race against time. While victims' lawyers prepared their cases, forces in the shadows moved to ensure the full content of Epstein's archive never reached a jury. The arrest was the catalyst for a series of events that would culminate in an empty cell and a deathly silence, leaving the world with a question that still remains unanswered today. Was the arrest the first step toward justice, or the first step toward the definitive closure of a file that was too dangerous to remain open? On July 6, 2019, the man who believed he was a god of evolution became a prisoner number once again, waiting for a trial that would never happen. On the morning of August 10, 2019, the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in New York, one of the most secure prisons in the world, became the epicenter of an information earthquake. Jeffrey Epstein, the man who held the secrets of the global elite, was found dead in his cell. In this 10th act of investigation and archive, we must dissect the anomalies surrounding this event. These are not simple conspiracy theories, but an accumulation of systemic failures so improbable they defy statistics. From cameras that stopped working to guards who simultaneously fell asleep, the scene in Cell 22 seems lifted from an espionage script designed to silence a key witness before he could testify. To understand the magnitude of the failure, one must analyze the security protocol. Weeks earlier, Epstein had already been found with marks on his neck, leading authorities to place him on suicide watch. However, for reasons the official archive has never satisfactorily explained, that watch was lifted shortly before his death. Protocol dictated that Epstein have a cellmate at all times, but his roommate was transferred the previous day, leaving him alone. The surveillance archive of the cell block shows that the two cameras pointing directly at his cell entrance suffered a technical failure that night, resulting in unusable footage. In a maximum security federal facility, for the recording system to fail precisely at the most critical time and place is, at the very least, a monumental coincidence. The guards assigned to his custody that night, Tova Knoll and Michael Thomas, did not perform the mandatory 30-minute rounds. Instead, according to investigation logs, they spent the night surfing the internet and sleeping. The forensic archive also presents inconsistencies pointed out by independent experts, including pathologist Michael Baden, hired by the Epstein family. Baden noted that the fracture of the hyoid bone in Epstein-Oprah's neck is more common in cases of strangulation by a third party than in suicides by hanging. Although the official version from the New York Medical Examiner's Office ruled it a suicide, the shadow of doubt spread quickly. A man with so much compromising information was far more valuable dead than alive to dozens of powerful figures. Epstein's death instantly transformed his living archive, his own memory and ability to testify, into a dead archive of documents and hard drives. But who truly benefited from his silence? In this act, we suggest that his disappearance was a preemptive relief for multiple governments and fortunes. Had Epstein reached a plea deal to reduce his sentence, he would have had to name names, places, and dates. He would have had to explain how the recruitment network functioned and who the ultimate beneficiaries of the intelligence obtained were. With his death, the judicial system lost its most powerful lever. The victims, who hoped to see their aggressor face justice, found themselves betrayed once again by a system that, intentionally or not, allowed the world's most dangerous loose end to be eliminated. The archive of his final hours also reveals strange behavior. Epstein had signed a new will just 2 days before he died, moving his assets into a trust in the Virgin Islands, making civil claims by his victims immensely difficult. Was this an act of foresight before a planned suicide, or was it an instruction from his protectors to ensure his fortune wasn't dismantled after his elimination? The death in Cell 22 did not close the case. It turned it into an urban legend of state-sponsored impunity. The phrase "Epstein didn't kill himself" became a global meme, not just out of dark humor, but as an expression of the public's absolute distrust of official versions of power. As we conclude this act, we face the reality that Jeffrey Epstein's archive will never be complete. His death was the selective deletion of the most sensitive data. Cell 22 was not the end of a criminal, but the closing of a security breach that threatened to sink the power structure of the West. As Epstein's body was wheeled out on a gurney under the flashes of photographers, the world understood that the truth is a luxury the system cannot always afford. The investigation would continue against Epstein-Maxwell, but the master architect, the man who connected science, politics, and espionage, took his darkest secrets to the grave, leaving behind a trail of distrust that continues to erode faith in justice to this day. With Jeffrey Epstein's death in Cell 22, the power ecosystem he had built faced an existential crisis. The archive still existed, but the architect was no longer there to manage it. In this 11th act of Investigation and Archive, we analyze the figure of Epstein-Maxwell not just as an accomplice, but as the keeper of the keys to the kingdom. Following Epstein's disappearance, Maxwell became the primary target of justice and, simultaneously, the greatest threat to the elite who still feared exposure. Her capture at a luxury estate in New Hampshire in 2020 ended her flight, but it began a judicial process that many interpreted as a shadow play, a trial designed to convict one person while simultaneously protecting hundreds of names listed in the black books. Maxwell's role in the network was fundamental and qualitatively different from Epstein's. While Epstein was the financial engine and the blackmail strategist, Ghislaine was the social engineer. The daughter of media tycoon Robert Maxwell, who also died under mysterious circumstances with ties to multiple intelligence agencies, Ghislaine provided the veneer of respectability needed to infiltrate the most exclusive circles of London and New York. The trial archive proved she was responsible for normalizing the aberrant. It was she who recruited the young girls, gaining their trust with a maternal and sophisticated image. only to deliver them to Epstein's machinery of abuse. In the logic of investigation and archive, Maxwell was the bridge that allowed the island's depravity to be translated into political and social influence. The trial, held in the Southern District of New York in late 2021, was an exercise in judicial balancing. On one hand, the victim's testimony was harrowing and sufficient to secure a 20-year sentence. On the other hand, the scope of the investigation was notably limited. Despite mentions of high-profile figures in testimonies and flight logs, the prosecution focused almost exclusively on the crimes committed directly by Maxwell and Epstein between 1994 and 2004. The archive of names that everyone expected to see exposed, the clients, the accomplices, the shadow facilitators, remained, for the most part, under seal or outside the courtroom debate. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, but the network she helped weave was not dismantled. It was merely decapitated. One of the most disturbing pieces of this legacy is the fate of the seized materials. During the proceedings, reference was made to the existence of videos and photographs documenting the abuse, but the public never saw the full list of who appeared in them. Maxwell's defense attempted unsuccessfully to argue that she was being used as a scapegoat to protect more powerful men. The archive suggests there was an implicit pact. The system would accept Maxwell's head in exchange for keeping the secret of the clients intact. She became the final point in the official narrative, allowing institutions to breathe a sigh of relief and claim justice had been served while the network's international ramifications continued to operate in the gloom. Even from prison, Maxwell's legacy casts a long shadow. Her connections to Israeli, British, and American intelligence, inherited from her father, raise the possibility that her silence is in itself an ongoing transaction. Is Ghislaine serving her sentence as part of a deal to keep the definitive archive closed? In the information age, Maxwell's silence is the most expensive asset in the world. Every time a new civil lawsuit arises, or a small portion of Jane Doe documents is unsealed, Maxwell's specter reappears as a reminder that justice was partial. The archive of shadows did not close with her sentence. It grew deeper, hiding beneath her conviction a vast web of complicity that the system decided not to pursue. At the end of this act, we understand that the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell was a bittersweet victory. For the victims, it was official recognition of their suffering at the hands of a woman who systematically betrayed them. But for history, it was a missed opportunity to purge the corruption dwelling in the high spheres of global power. Maxwell is behind bars, but the strings she and Epstein pulled for 3 decades remain taut. The legacy of shadows is the realization that, in Jeffrey Epstein's world, individual convictions sometimes serve to protect collective impunity. While Ghislaine serves her years in a Florida cell, the archive she guarded remains a digital time bomb, waiting for someone with enough courage to finally turn the light on all the names the trial chose to ignore. The death of Jeffrey Epstein and the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell mark the end of an era, but in the world of intelligence and high power, information never dies. It simply changes hands. In this final act of investigation and archive, we must address the most haunting question. What happened to the physical and digital archive that was not seized by the FBI? There is a critical distinction between the evidence presented in a court of law and the blackmail arsenal accumulated over 30 years. While the public was distracted by the details of the trial, a great reset was taking place in the shadows. Intelligence agencies, former business associates, and the entities that facilitated Epstein's rise scrambled to claim the remains of his empire, not for its monetary value, but for the control of the future narrative. The concept of power inheritance in this context does not refer to who kept his properties in the Virgin Islands, but to who now holds the encryption keys to his private servers. Epstein's archive was a living ecosystem of vulnerabilities. Following his disappearance, a reconfiguration of the global influence board has been observed. Figures who were once staples of his circle have sought refuge in new alliances, while others have seen their secrets surgically leaked to influence electoral processes or corporate decisions. This suggests that the archive was not destroyed, but has been fragmented. In the black market of high-level information, Epstein's secrets have become a currency used by state and parastatal actors to secure loyalties or eliminate rivals under the guise of new leaks. A fundamental aspect of this Great Reset is the evolution of methods. Epstein was an operator of the analog era who adapted to the digital, but his successors have perfected the system. Today, the capture of intelligence does not necessarily require physical mansions or private islands. It is conducted through the very infrastructure of the Internet and big data analysis. However, the Epstein method, personal and physical compromise, remains the gold standard of political blackmail. The archive suggests that new networks, more discrete and compartmentalized, have emerged to fill the void. These networks have learned from Epstein's mistakes. They have eliminated media visibility and diversified their assets to prevent a single point of failure, like the arrest of a leader, from collapsing the entire system. Who truly inherited the power? The short answer is, the system that created him. Jeffrey Epstein was not an anomaly, but a product of a system that rewards a lack of ethics when it translates into competitive advantage. The banks that processed his suspicious transactions for years, the universities that ignored alarms in exchange for donations, and the intelligence services that utilized him as an external asset, all have survived the scandal. For them, Epstein's sacrifice was a necessary operating cost to keep the structure intact. The Great Reset allowed these institutions to undergo a cosmetic cleaning, firing a few executives or changing department names, while the flow of influence and the control of secrets continued under new compliance regulations that only served to better hide the tracks. In this final act, we must also reflect on the role of truth in the era of misinformation. Epstein's archive has become a modern myth, an inexhaustible source of theories that often serve to obscure proven facts. This is perhaps the ultimate form of inheritance, turning a real crime into a confusion so vast that justice becomes impossible. As long as the names of the powerful continue to appear in documents declassified in drips, a state of permanent suspicion is maintained that weakens trust in democracy. This is Epstein's final legacy, a world where we all know the archive exists, but no one has enough power to open it completely without risking the destruction of the very fabric of society as we know it. We close this investigation, understanding that the Jeffrey Epstein case does not have a period, but a semicolon. The archive is now a collective shadow. Although the cameras in the mansions have been removed and the private jets have new owners, the architecture of surveillance and blackmail that he perfected remains the hidden engine of many global decisions. Epstein's story is the story of how power protects itself, sacrificing pieces that become too heavy to carry. As we turn off the light on this file, we are left with the certainty that somewhere in an encrypted server or a reinforced safe, the rest of the archive waits for its moment, reminding us that knowledge of others' sins remains the purest and most dangerous form of capital in the 21st century. While the main narrative of the Epstein file concludes with his death and the conviction of his primary accomplice, the investigation and archive would be incomplete without addressing the structural machinery that allowed his operation to function for over 30 years. This final act serves as a forensic autopsy of the systems, financial, psychological, and geopolitical, that provided the oxygen for his network. If the previous acts focused on the who and the what, this appendix focuses on the how and the why it remains a threat to the global institutional framework. Forensic finance, the architecture of impunity. The most persistent question in the Epstein archive is the origin and movement of his wealth. Jeffrey Epstein did not manage money in the traditional sense. He managed relationships that generated money. His primary vehicle, Southern Trust Company, based in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was not merely a family office but a sophisticated clearinghouse for influence capital. Forensic analysis suggests that Epstein's wealth was subsidized by high-value clients who paid not for market returns, but for the access and protection he provided. The complicity of major financial institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank is central to this annex. Internal bank communications, later unsealed in civil litigation, reveal that compliance officers flagged Epstein's accounts hundreds of times for suspicious activity, including large cash withdrawals and payments to young women. Yet senior executives overrode these warnings. This demonstrates that Epstein had achieved systemic immunity. He was so deeply embedded in the financial lives of the ultra-wealthy that reporting him was perceived as a risk to the bank's most profitable relationships. His wealth was a feedback loop. The more powerful his clients, the less likely the banks were to intervene, creating a black hole in the global anti-money laundering (AML) system. 2. The geopolitical web beyond the United States. Epstein's operations were never confined to American soil. The archive reveals a pattern of international expansion that mirrored the interests of global intelligence services. In France, his connection to Jean-Luc Brunel and the MC2 modeling agency served as a primary pipeline for European recruitment. Brunel's subsequent death in a French prison, also by suicide while awaiting trial, highlights the lethal nature of the secrets held within this European branch of the network. Furthermore, the Prince Andrew connection was more than just a royal scandal. It was a strategic bridge into the British establishment and, by extension, the Commonwealth's diplomatic circles. Epstein utilized his relationship with the Duke of York to gain access to international trade envoys and foreign heads of state. This international reach suggests that the network functioned as a stateless intelligence agency, one that collected leverage on leaders regardless of their nationality. The nervousness of foreign governments upon Epstein's 2019 arrest was not merely about personal scandal, but about the potential exposure of bilateral backdoor diplomacy that had been brokered on Epstein's properties. Third, the psychological mechanics of the honey trap. To understand the efficacy of the Epstein archive, one must analyze the psychological engineering behind the honey trap. Epstein and Maxwell did not just offer illegal services, they created an environment of codependency. By involving powerful men in illicit acts, they created a permanent bond of mutual assured destruction. The archive suggests that Epstein was a student of behavioral psychology, specifically focusing on how to normalize deviance within a closed social circle. He used his properties as controlled environments where the usual social and legal constraints were suspended. Once a target crossed the line, Epstein didn't necessarily need to threaten them with a videotape. The mere knowledge that Epstein could destroy them was enough to ensure their cooperation in his financial or political schemes. This is the essence of soft power blackmail. It does not require a gun to the head, only a permanent stain on the conscience and the reputation. 4. The unresolved digital trail. Finally, the archive must address the missing digital evidence. During the FBI raids on his Manhattan mansion and Little St. James, significant amounts of hardware were seized, but intelligence experts believe the most sensitive material was stored on decentralized servers, or dead man switches, located in jurisdictions with no extradition treaties. The existence of high-definition surveillance systems throughout his properties implies the existence of a massive library of compromat. The true grand reset of the archive lies in the possibility that this digital library was duplicated and distributed before the FBI arrived. If this is true, the Epstein network hasn't ended. It has simply evolved into a ghost network. The power formerly held by Epstein is now held by whoever possesses the master keys to these digital vaults. This turns the Epstein case from a historical event into a contemporary security threat, as those currently in power may still be operating under the shadow of files that have yet to see the light of day. V. Conclusion of the archive. The Epstein dossier is a warning about the fragility of our institutions when faced with a predator who understands the intersection of wealth, lust, and intelligence. It proves that with enough capital and the right secrets, an individual can operate outside the boundaries of human law for decades. While the names in the Black Book may eventually fade from the headlines, the blueprint Epstein created for the subversion of power remains a dark template for others to follow. The archive is closed, but the shadows it revealed continue to dance across the halls of global influence.